Okay, another video. This one is more kind of my kind of SQL. By that, what I basically mean is it's nuts. I kind of like this stuff. It's just how my head works. I like the weird and wacky kind of SQL-y things, making it do funky stuff. So this basically was born out of a situation I came across where we just had reams and reams of delimited strings held within a table, and people wanted them splitting out into columns. If you look on the internet, there's reams of information about splitting single strings by a delimiter. So nowadays you can use string split as of SQL 2016, but there's nothing really that kind of says how to properly turn tables worth of delimited strings into columns. String split itself just pivots it into rows, and then you'd have to do a lot of manipulation around it. So I kind of went a bit, let's say, kind of off-piste and decided to make something a bit more dynamic that would actually do this in kind of a more funky way. So, so this is my video about it. Videos for QTech, my current company, and so yeah, let's see what happens. So, firstly, still love that. I was really bored that day. So what this is basically splitting a table full of strings into columns. So, if we start with this, which you can already see on screen, I fabricated some data out of AdventureWorks. Now, in this scenario, I'm not going to lie, this kind of specific one would be easy enough to do with kind of substrings and char indexes and stuff, because everything's a set width. But just imagine it isn't. Okay, for the sake of argument, imagine that these aren't all fixed width columns. The situation I was working in, they weren't. They were all over the place. It was just the fact that it was pipe delimited. So I've just fabricated a set of data. So you can kind of see here, we've just got a ream of data that's just all pipe delimited and all happily kind of held in a column. Now what we effectively want to do is split this out into individual columns. So in this top row, for example, we would have the 43659 as one column, then the SO blah blah as the next column, the 10-4 as the next column, etc. So this is the data I'm going to work with. So first off, I'm just going to create a fake table. It's just going to have the raw data in it. It's just going to have an identity. The identity is kind of pretty irrelevant really, but we're going to go with it anyway. So I'm going to insert my data into that. Now we can therefore just imagine that this is now our table that we've come across in our database that just happens to have a whole load of columns and then this kind of string monstrosity at the end of it that we want to split out into columns. So the destination for our data is going to look roughly like this. This is based on the data I've just fed in. So sales order ID, sales order number, account number, customer ID, etc. So this is what we're going to end up with. And you can see that this is going to start off nice and blank. Success. So first things first, as I mentioned, most people now can split a string. Okay, if you happen to have a string like this, from 2016 onwards in SQL Server, you can use string split. Prior to that, just Google splitting strings. There's reams of ways out there of how to do this. So effectively, all this is going to do is take this, use this as the delimiter to say every time you see a pipe, split this. And obviously, if you run this, you will end up with the row basically pivoted. So you've now got each, what you want to be a column is now a row. So you can kind of see it split it off into each section. So we've got them all nicely down here. So that's all fine. And that's great if you've got a single string. It's fast, it's efficient, it does the job. Slightly more of a problem if you have an entire table's worth of them. So we can use it in a table format, we just cross apply into it. So I'm basically saying, okay, for my table, which we know is this because I created it just a second ago, I'm basically going to pivot out each one of these, okay, by cross applying into the string split using the sales raw and using the pipe. And if I do that, you will see we will just get a huge table because we had 1,000 rows and we've now got 6,000 rows because each one has become 6 rows. So you can see here, this is row 1, this is row 2, etc. Okay, so it's basically pivoted them all out. Again, all well and good, but not ideal if you want to kind of put them back into a columnar format. So what I'm going to do as my first port of call is I'm actually going to kind of give them a column identity. So we know that this is column 1, this is going to be column 2, this is going to be column 3, etc. So that's going to be column 1, and that's going to be column 2. You get the idea. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to add a row number in, and the row number is going to partition by sales row ID, so our identity basically. So we're going to partition on this. All it means is that every time it sees a new sales row ID, it's going to go back to 1 again. So we're going to get an incremental ID, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then when it sees the next one, it's going to go back to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, back to 1. So it should give us a 1 against each of these, a 2 against each of these. You get the idea. So I'm going to just add in my row number. And as you can see, that's exactly what it's done. So it's going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We see a new sales row ID. So it's going to start 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We see a new sales row ID, etc. So now we have, these are all now column ID 1. These are all column ID 2. You get the gist. So what we've now done is basically given them IDs. At least we now know how to kind of put these together so that we could pull out all of the column 1s. We could pull out all of the column 2s. We can pull out all of the column 3s through till 6. Now, just to make life easier for me, I don't want to kind of keep repeating this because it's quite a cluttered bit of code. Later on, this will look a bit nastier. So I'm just going to kind of put this into a temp table for the moment. So that data we just saw, all 6,000 rows, I'm just going to throw in a temp table. Just makes life a bit easier. So now what we can see is, as I was explaining above, if we do select where column ID equals 1, we'll get all of our sales order ID values. So basically the first part of our sales raw. Okay. If we do where column ID 2, you'll see we get the second part, which in this case you can see is all the SO data. We're going to get all the SO data. So we can actually pull out each individual one. Now, what we can do from here is basically we can link these together. So we know that this is column ID 2, but it's from sales row ID 7. And this is column 2, but it's from sales row ID 8. In this one, we can see this is column 1 from sales row ID 7. This is column 1 from sales row ID 8. So what we can basically do is now join these together on their sales row ID. This gets kind of confusing, but you'll see when I start, kind of producing the data. So what we're going to do is we're going to join temp back to itself on the sales row ID, but we're just going to say join temp with just the column 1s to temp with just the column 2s. If we do that, what you'll see is now we can start kind of building this out. So column 1 is this, column 2 is this. For this sales row ID, column 1 is this, column 2 is this. We've obviously left this in so you can validate it, but as you can see as we go down, for sales row ID 6, that's column 1, that's column 2. So this is kind of how we start to build these out in order to turn this value here into columns. Okay, so we start kind of turning these into columns so we can split them out. Now, this is obviously kind of an expandable operation. So if we now want to add in a third column, we can do exactly the same thing again. So join on the temp table again, back onto sales row ID equals sales row ID, but this time where column ID equals 3. So you can see we can kind of blow it out again. So we've now got the first 3 columns. And we could keep doing this until we had every single thing blown out. Bit of a pain. I mean, it's fine if you've got 3 columns, 4 columns. You wouldn't want to be doing this if you've got 20 columns, 30 columns, 50 columns. It's going to be quite onerous, very manual, very painful. But what we can see is a pattern. So now we've got our temp table. You can see there's a pattern for, if we start just with column 1, then for each column we wish to add, you just do a join and specify that we're adding column the next. So we're going to do a join, specify column the next. So you can kind of see there's a pattern. So what we can do is actually abuse that by kind of dynamically building up these joins. So In our case, we basically want to know how many columns there are. So if we look at this, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 columns. But because of our little column ID column, we can tell there's 6 because it always stops at 6 before it restarts itself with the identity again. So we can basically say, okay, the max of this is the total number of columns that we're looking at, because we know that's how many columns there are. So we can basically say, how many joins are we going to need? Well, actually, we're going to need 6 joins. Okay, because we're trying to get 6 columns worth out. So we can kind of create now a bit of a template. Using this kind of code above, we can generate ourselves a template. We're basically going to say, okay, for our first column, just to get our very first column out, so these values here, all we would need to do is basically run this select value from temp where column ID equals 1. That works. I've split it into 3 because you'll see why in a second. But I've basically created variables so we can split this up into 3 sections: a select statement, a from statement, and a where statement. So that's effectively our first column. So now we're going to start from join number 2 because this is our second table effectively. So we know how many joins we're going to need. We're going to need effectively to use 6 tables. We're going to need to use our temp table 6 times to get the 6 columns out. We've got that here using our little numJoins variable. So what we can now say is, well, let's do this. Now this looks horrendously messy. It's really not if you break it down, because a lot of it is just me making annotations on it. So what we're saying is for each new column we want to pull out, we need to add in a new join. Okay, so in order to add our new join, what we're going to do is, well, first on run 2 we're going to add in t2.value, and then we're going to say, well, join t2 on t1.salesRowID equals t2.salesRowID, where t2.columnID equals 2. And then for the third iteration, so our third iteration up here, we're effectively saying join t3, where t3 and t3. So again, we do the same thing here. So for the next join, when this is 3, we will say, okay, add to our select line t3.value, add to our join t3 on salesRowID equals t3.salesRowID, where t3.columnID equals 3. So you can see, because of the pattern, all we're using is a simple while loop to build a statement. So if I was now to run this and print out my results, what you'll see is that I've just built out the exact statement we had above. So select T1, T2 value, T3 value up to T6 value, and we're going to do from T1 join T2 on salesRow equals T2 salesRow, join T3 on T1 salesRow ID equals T3 salesRow ID, T4 on T4. So you can see how it's actually just built it up. And then the same with the where clauses. T1 column ID equals 1, T2 equals 2, T3 equals 3, T4 equals 4. So you can see how we're actually just using effectively the join number to create our dynamic SQL in order to kind of build up our statement. And now, having done that, if we were to actually run this statement, so let's actually put this in here and run this, you'll see we've actually created our result set. By doing all these kind of join to itself, we're effectively pivoting them all out, and we've now got our result set. This is what we would have achieved had we continued down this road of just adding in a new join for the next column, another join for the next column, another join for the next column. All we've done is generated this dynamically by using the simple kind of incremental logic. So what we could now do is, taking out all of our annotations to make this a little bit smaller, you can see how all I've done is done exactly the same query, just without the annotations. And then at the end, I've just said, okay, create me one big SQL statement, put together my select, my tables and my where, build one big SQL statement, print it and run it. So if I now go here and run this, we get our result. It builds the statement, which you can see here in the background. It builds this dynamically and then executes it. So we've now effectively split our row of delimited string into columns. Okay. Now the fun bit is where we kind of make this a bit more generic. What if we have a table that has this exact data in it, but then we also have another table that has similar data, but it's over 20 delimited columns, or one with 30, or one with 7, or one with 5, or one with 3, or one. We could have numerous tables throughout our database that have this type of data inserted into them, maybe by a rogue application, or any sort of third-party system that seems to be loading this. I mean, a lot of XML gets put in. I've also seen a lot of this kind of delimited text gets put in as well. So we could actually have this at all different shapes and sizes. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this a bit more generic. So I'm going to create a couple of tables, test import 1 and test import 2. The tables are the same, they're kind of irrelevant really. This is basically just mimicking data that we've got in our tables or we've received that is kind of split in different ways. So you can see here, I'm just going to populate them. This top one is just going to be 3 columns, and this bottom one is going to be 6 columns. Okay, and I'm just going to put them in. So now you can see we have our different tables in our database with data, followed by these random delimited strings that have appeared due to whatever application that's feeding them to us. Now, we don't want to kind of have to run manual code that's actually going to kind of turn these into columns. So our kind of select from here, join here, where this, the one we wrote originally, we don't want to do that for every single eventuality. There may be hundreds. So what we're going to do is put our previous code, the one that actually built the statement itself and then executed it, and we're going to put that into a proc. So I'm just going to wrap this into a proc that basically says we can pass in a table name. Okay, now what this proc is going to do, I'll create it first. Okay, is basically it's just going to do everything we did above. It's going to say, okay, you've given me a table name. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do the row number. So I'm going to kind of give each, by doing a string split, I'm going to pivot everything out and work out how many columns you have in your delimited string. So it's going to do our very original step where we just pivoted everything out and gave it a row number in order to be able to map the new column 1 to the new column 1 to the new column 1 to the new column 1 per row. So it's going to do that in dynamic SQL using the table name that's been passed in. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to execute that and put it into a temp table. So again, this is just mimicking what we did earlier with the select row number over partition into temp table from our string split version. So we're just doing this in dynamic SQL now. So that's going to give us our temp table. Once we've got our temp table, we run exactly the code we ran before. From our temp table, we work out how many tables are going to be required within our dynamically built query. We start with our little template, and then for each new join we need, so for each new column we're effectively pivoting out, we add the relevant code into our template. So we add a new column into our select list, we add a new join, and we add a new where clause. Okay, and then we put this all together into a piece of SQL, we print it, we execute it. This is now completely dynamic. Whichever table we pass in, we will get the correct result out. So if we run this for test import 1, we get out 3 columns. If we run this for test import 2, we get 6 columns. So basically, no matter how many delimiters you have in your string, you can then just pass your table to this procedure and it will just spit out that string nicely in column format. So you can put in whole tables worth of delimited strings and get a columnar table back. So effectively it just turns it into a table that you can then use. I mean, obviously you could do exec into for these store procedures, put them into a temp table and start manipulating them. So it gives you that ability to now dissect the strings and use them as if they are tables. I don't know if anyone will find this useful. It was just something I happened to come across when I was actually working on someone's site, and I just found it interesting and I kind of went a bit too far with it. But I kind of like making things a lot more automated and a lot more flexible and dynamic. So initially, the one I was working on, I could have done it manually by just kind of saying temp 1, join temp 2, join temp 3 and be done. But I kind of wanted the ability to pass in different tables and be able to get out different result sets. So like I said, you can now run these and it will actually split them up into their specific relevant column statuses. So I just found this interesting. Other people might find a use for this. Whether they do or don't, I don't know, but the techniques might work for people. Just a funky way of using dynamic SQL, a few loops, building strings, and then executing them to achieve a goal. If this was a bit confusing, I went through it quite quickly. There was a lot of SQL involved in this. I do actually have this as a written blog as well. So if you go to qtech.co.uk, go to our SQL Server blog, you will actually find a blog on there that's, it's called, here you go, you can see on here. It's actually called just splitting a table full of strings into columns. So if you actually go over there, I've actually got the full written version. So you can actually see the full written with examples, with screenshots, more explanation as to how I've built this up. And yeah, it might prove useful. So there you go. And as just mentioned, for anything else you want, any other blogs, etc., any questions, just go to qtech.co.uk. I have links in the description. Yeah, see you later.